Our journey begins today, 600 miles off the coast of Ecuador in South America, one of the farthest places from home I've ever been.
I'm Dr. John Morris, the lead scientist on this trip. My expertise is geology and rocks, and I'm particularly interested in this group of rocks, the Galapagos Islands. I've always dreamed of seeing them with my own eyes.
My name is Joshua, and my father is leading this expedition. This is truly an amazing place. I feel like I'm at the far side of the world.
All right, fellas, let's go over this itinerary here. Peter, will you walk us from our starting point to where we're going to be going each day?
Sure. So we landed in Baltimore.
I'm John Irwin. I'm not a scientist or a historian. I'm a filmmaker. My brother and I are here to capture and document this place. And to tell the truth, I have no idea what to expect or what I'll see. For me, this is a journey of discovery.
So looking at what we're going to see, Doug, I'm wondering what my cameras are going to see. Is it going to be more than my cameras can handle, or is it one animal every 4 hours?
Well, it really depends on where we're going to be, but in most places, I think you're going to have a whole lot more than your camera can handle. I'll give you an example. When we're right
I'm Doug Phillips, and I love this place. I've been dreaming of this expedition for more than 20 years. Almost 2 centuries ago, a man named Charles Darwin voyaged here, and the world was never the same. One of my greatest passions is history, and after thousands of hours of research, I feel like I know the man. Darwin got some things right, but I'm convinced he got even more things wrong. And the result was a lot of confusion about science, life, man, pretty much everything. We're here to set that record straight. I'm also excited to be able to share this adventure with my son, Joshua. And our mission is simple: to test Darwin's ideas in the light of good science and eternal truth. The timing of our expedition is priceless. We're here on the year of the 200th anniversary of the birth of Charles Darwin and the 150th of the publishing of his famous book on the origin of species. We're expecting to see some of the most diverse and amazing creatures known to mankind. In fact, the first explorers here called these islands enchanted. This is a place filled with questions. How did the animals get here? Why do they behave differently from animals in other parts of the world? What is the real message of their unusual transformations? Modern Darwinists call these islands a laboratory for evolution. But there's another perspective. These islands are a showcase for the wisdom of the Creator. But before we hit the open seas, we'll ride to the far end of Santa Cruz, one of the few inhabited spots on the Galapagos. We're here to track down the creature these islands are famous for, the gigantic Galapagos tortoise.
now that we've disembarked the boat and we're going to be heading up to the mountain, this is what I've been looking forward to. This is, for me, the highlight of the whole trip, is for us to be able to find these giant tortoises in the wild. And let's look for the biggest ones, let's look for the oldest ones, and God willing, we'll make it up there. For me, this has been more than 25 years in the waiting, ever since I was a boy and I started collecting reptiles like tortoises, turtles. And I dreamed of the day that someday I would see in their actual habitat the most magnificent reptile on the planet, the Galapagos tortoise. This is their habitat. We're here, we've made it. And I wonder what it was like for the Spaniards when they came here, because you know they named the islands Galapagos after the tortoises because of the dome-shaped crest on the tortoise matched the Spanish word for Galapagos, a kind of a saddle. And so for all these years, people have come here. When they think of these islands, they think of this incredible creature. So it's going to be exciting to see how many we can find and to actually watch them in their natural habitat. Let's go take a look. All right, we've got him. There's our first one. Come on, let's go. Follow me. Oh, it's a beauty. It's a big one. It's a huge one. Oh, take a look at this guy. Oh, he's beautiful. Let's quietly and carefully approach this incredible male. Now, notice that this guy is not afraid of me. He's sticking his head out, and just a few minutes ago, he was on the fast track to chase down that female that we saw up there. But this guy is not happy right now because she got away. That's the female. Did you hear? I'm not sure which direction she's going in. All right, big guy. Here he comes. He's decided he's going to just keep on going. Look at this guy. He is a massive creature. You know, we actually have fossil records of tortoises that show that at one point in time, these guys got to be twice as big as this. But however they got here, whether it was someone floated, or they came over on a floating log mat, or possibly humans brought you here, the secret has never really been revealed. We can't be sure, but they did get here, and they have been flourishing on these islands. Just stunning creatures that God has created. Oh, that's beautiful. Look at that. But the story behind this tortoise and the other tortoises here on this island and the other islands of the Galapagos, I think, is where we need to begin our journey. The truth is, you can only find giant turtles in a couple places of the world. There are some in the Aldebaran Islands and the Seychelles, and then there's the Galapagos, and these are the most famous islands. In fact, when the Bishop of Panama came here back in the 16th century, this is one of the first things that he noticed and he wrote about, and this in fact was called the Island of the Tortoises, because no one had seen anything quite like this before. It's simply amazing. And they live, in fact, they're the most long-lived animals on the entire planet, living, many believe, over 200 years in age, which means that hypothetically, if you meet a really old tortoise, it could have been here when Charles Darwin was here, less than 200 years ago.
These animals are like nothing I've ever seen before. The United Nations requires that we not touch them, and that we stay 2 meters from the animals at all times. The trouble is, they come to us. I've never seen anything like it. These animals aren't afraid of me. This place is truly amazing. But one question stands out above all.
Why are we here? Tell me a little bit of why you invited us to be on this journey with you.
Well, I say there's two parts to the answer. Part number one is, it is the defining issue at the defining time. But as I was approaching the year 2009 and the anniversary of Darwin, some years ago, I said, we've got to go to ground zero. We've got to go to basically the Jerusalem of the evolutionary worldview. That's Galapagos. But how that was going to come to pass, a number of things needed to come together, and in the providence of God, all of them did.
Tell me about your phone call. Why did you decide to come?
I have had a burning desire to go to the Galapagos for a long time. So this has been a dream come true for me.
But John is not only a doctor, a PhD in the area of geology, he is a wonderful generalist. He can speak to so many different issues. And when we came to Galapagos, we knew that we would have to handle the geology, but we also have to talk biology. We have to talk genetics. We have to talk a bunch of different issues. As president of ICR, he's overseen an entire network and staff of scientists who specialize in these different areas, and that's given him a unique ability to grasp many different issues.
How can Darwin come to these islands and make the leap across this huge chasm of mutations and variation in a beak of a finch?
As we sat together, I felt I had 1,000 questions for Doug and Dr. Morris. The biggest one was simple. Who exactly was Charles Darwin? And what were the true origins of his ideas and his worldview?
It was September 15th, 1835, when Darwin set foot on the Galapagos Islands, young and curious, just 26 years old. But Darwin's journey began years before. He was just a boy when he was first exposed to the writings of his famous grandfather, the religious skeptic Erasmus Darwin. Erasmus published a provocative book called Zoonomia, in which he argued that all of life evolved over millions of years from lower life forms. And he gave the Darwins a new family motto, E conchis omnia, everything from shells. Despite the skepticism of grandfather Erasmus, Charles Darwin's father sent his son to university to study for the clergy. But rather than reinforcing a belief in the Bible, the seminary of Darwin's day taught a new form of skepticism called natural theology. In those days, the authority of the Bible was under intense scrutiny. Natural theologians attempted to argue for the existence of God, but they did so from nature alone, not the Bible. From these men, Darwin was taught that the Bible had good moral principles, but that it could not be trusted on matters of science. Because they denied the Genesis record of the age of the earth and the global catastrophic flood, they taught that God did indeed create the world, but millions of years ago. And he created plants and animals in their current locations, and they have not changed since then. From British naturalist John Ray, many had embraced a notion never taught in the scriptures that the works created by God at first are by him conserved to this day, in the same state and condition in which they were made. This confusing idea of the fixity of species created a false dichotomy between scripture and science. The result was compromise. Darwin would bring these beliefs and growing concerns over the legitimacy of Christianity on board the HMS Beagle during its famous 5-year voyage. Darwin had been recommended to Captain Robert Fitzroy as a traveling companion, but soon after they set sail, he assumed the role of naturalist. Their 5-year journey took them from Africa to South America and to the Galapagos. Over the course of his voyage, Darwin observed hundreds of diverse types of animals, but it troubled him when he realized that many of the plants and animals of the Galapagos were similar to those he had seen in South America. Darwin's natural theology and his observations began to conflict, and he found himself with questions. Why would a creator design creatures on the Galapagos that look so similar to, but are obviously different from animals in other parts of the world? As they visited each island, Darwin collected plant and animal specimens. He was particularly interested in the finches and mockingbirds. He noticed that some had wide beaks, perfect for crushing nuts, while others had long beaks. It seemed these animals were indeed changing to survive. While on these islands, Darwin had many questions, but it was not until after his return to England, while cataloging his collections and polishing his journals, that he began to draw radical conclusions from his findings. For nearly a quarter century, he quietly developed his theory. Finally, in 1859, he published his controversial book on the origin of species by means of natural selection, or the preservation of favored races in the struggle for life. Darwin argued that in the epic struggle for life, animals which develop characteristics best suited to the environment survive and pass their favorable traits to their offspring, a process he called natural selection. His conclusion was that the cumulative effect of gradual changes over the span of millions of years was a process by which all organic beings which have ever lived on the earth have descended from some one primordial form. Although he never returned to the Galapagos, he forever attributed his idea to these islands. When Darwin arrived on these islands, he was wearing glasses. We're wearing them too. In fact, everybody wears glasses. I'm not referring to reading glasses or bifocals, but the worldview lens through which we interpret facts and form our view of reality. By the time he reached the Galapagos, Darwin had been taught that the Bible had to be wrong concerning science and that the Earth was millions of years old. His interpretations and ideas were shaped by his basic assumptions. But we've come here with a different set of glasses. We are Christians and creationists, and we presuppose the authority of the Bible, and we do so without apology. This means we believe the Bible is completely true, from cover to cover, inspired by God, and we're standing on this truth as our foundation. We believe that the six-day account of creation found in Genesis, the first book of the Bible, really happened, and that it happened not very long ago. We believe it cannot be dismissed or explained away as an allegory, myth, or legend, and we're convinced you cannot separate it from the rest of the Bible, believing only in parts and not the whole. We believe that when you're wearing the right glasses, there's no contradiction between the truth of Scripture and the observations of science, and to depart from these foundations is to render science incoherent. And our view is under intense opposition. In his book, The Meaning of Evolution, G. Richard Bozarth says, "The day will come when the evidence constantly accumulates around the evolutionary theory and becomes so massively persuasive that even the last and most fundamental Christian warriors will have to lay down their arms and surrender unconditionally. I believe that day will be the end of Christianity." Avowed atheist and evolutionist Richard Dawkins states in his new book, The Greatest Show on Earth, that bishops and theologians who have attended to the evidence for evolution have given up the struggle against it. But is that true? Has Darwin's evolutionary thesis birthed at Galapagos conquered Christianity? Is the debate really over? We're here to answer these questions, for this is the place where all the controversy began, the Galapagos Islands.
I don't know how anyone couldn't be overwhelmed with history just standing right here. This is the spot where Charles Darwin came and the world changed after he arrived here. And he landed here and he walked out on beaches just like this. He looked into the woods, he looked at the animals, and he came up with his interpretation. To be here in the 200th anniversary of the birth of Darwin, this is incredible.
We stepped onto the red sand of Jervis Island and were greeted by one of the friendliest animals I've ever seen, Galapagos sea lions, relatives of the sea lions of California who came here from the north. I think they were as interested in us as we were in them.
Wow, I'm standing right here just a couple feet away from this beautiful juvenile sea lion who was just talking to me a minute ago. Thus far on our trip, pretty much everywhere we go, we're walking up to animals and they're just looking at us. They're letting us come right up to them, and they just don't have the normal fear of man that we see elsewhere. It's a remarkable experience.
Swimming.
Wow, but there's so many of them together.
So many around, yeah. That's
Wow,
yeah.
I mean, that's a lot of sharks. Let me tell you, I'm counting 1, 2, 3, 4,
It's
5,
in cycle, in cycle.
6, 7. That's a lot of sharks.
Yeah, big ones.
They look to me like they're
Big
6
ones,
feet
big
long,
ones,
7
big
feet
ones,
long?
6, 7.
Yeah, 7 feet long. That's a big shark. But they're not predatory to man here.
No,
That's good to know, especially when we get in the water. It's good to know.
those are sharks, yeah.
Yeah.
Those Galapagos sharks.
Life beneath the water in the Galapagos is like another world. And honestly, it was some of the most difficult dives I've ever attempted. The reason is 7 major currents converge on these islands, creating some of the most nutrient-rich seas along the equator. It seems most all life here depends on the ocean in some way. The currents are harsh, and the water is also colder than you would expect at the equator. This creates a unique environment where lizards and penguins can coexist. This allows for great diversity. In fact, there are over 500 species in the seas of the Galapagos, 80 of which can be found here and nowhere else on Earth. What we saw in our short time beneath the waves was amazing. But our dive master's in these waters almost every day, and the footage he showed us was extraordinary. For a brief moment, he even swam with an albino whale shark, something he said no one had ever captured on film.
Jarvis Island isn't the biggest island we're going to be at, and it isn't the most lush in terms of life, but I think there's some things we can walk away from here with. This is Julian Huxley, who of course was one of the great evolutionists, the grandson of Thomas Huxley. Here's what he says. It was here, it was on the Galapagos in the early autumn of 1835 that Darwin took the first steps out of the fairyland of creationism into the coherent and comprehensible world of modern biology. And then he goes on to say, it was here that he became fully convinced that species are not immutable, in other words, that evolution is a fact.
He says evolution has become comprehensible. Well, you know, I would like, as a scientist, to see some evidence that it really did happen. We can talk about it happening. We can talk about this kind of changing into that, of fish growing legs and coming out of the sea, and yet, where's the evidence that it happened? We need evidence that any basic type of animal ever changed into something else.
When people think of evolution, they think of Darwin, but he was not the first to argue for evolution. However, he was the first to provide the Western world with a unified theory of origins to replace the biblical account. Darwin's unique contribution was a process, a mechanism to explain changes. He called this natural selection. And nowhere is the controversy surrounding the mysterious process of natural selection more evident than on the black lava rocks of Fernandina Island. As the sun rises here, monsters begin to wake. Marine iguanas, different than any other iguanas on Earth. Sources of food on land are scarce, so these creatures have developed the ability to feed in the sea. After the morning sun has warmed them, they begin to move towards the ocean, one by one, swimming out to feed on the rich algae growing on the rocks below. They can die for only a few minutes because their core temperatures drop dangerously low. Staying down too long can prove deadly. After they've had their fill, they begin an often treacherous journey back to land to warm in the morning sun. Then, if you're quiet enough, you can hear the amazing sound of change. This is fantastic. We have finally made it out here to the resting ground of these incredible creatures. Darwin said of these marine iguanas that they were the most disgusting, clumsy lizards. And Captain Fitzroy, who brought them down here, thought that they were simply horrible. But some of the mariners that made it out here, they actually ate the lizards. One person described them as being sweetmeat. Most people wouldn't go near them. And look at these guys.
I mean, in one sense, they're pretty hideous with these crests. They actually look like dragons. But I think from a creation perspective, these are, in one sense, some of the most beautiful creatures in the world. And they're beautiful because they are one of the greatest examples I can think of the principle of mediated design. Of course, Darwin talks about natural selection, and there's a sense in which natural selection, of course, is true. Animals adapt to their environment. But the lizard is an example of not an animal mutating and gaining new information, but of the fact that when God designed these original lizard kind, he gave them the potential to adapt to all sorts of different environments. And in this particular case, these animals are singular. They swim in the water, they live in the water. They swim underneath the water. They can hold their breath for long periods of time underneath the water. They're the only lizards in the entire world that can do just that, only found here in the Galapagos. And they fit perfectly with the environment. And so we call this mediative design, that there was an original design, but then all the potential was built in for them to have these variations when they come out here. It really is amazing. And not only that, if you look carefully, you watch the head movements and you listen, every couple of minutes you see them sneezing salt. And that's a very special gland that has adapted to this particular environment that was part of the genetic potential designed in them from the very beginning, so they can expel all the salt they get from being in the water. This is a pretty big problem for the evolutionists, because the evolutionists see several other types of reptiles that have developed salt-spitting glands. There's one right there, fantastic. And the evolutionists say, well, each of these different types of reptiles had to uniquely develop these salt-spitting glands, but we think a better answer for this is that God designed these creatures with the potential to adapt to various environments. This particular environment, this type of creature, like this amazing monster in front of us, the built-in design recognized, here's what's going to work the best. He's about to blow. Wow. But those crests, all of that make them look so... There you go.
That's great. We also observe the flightless cormorant, a unique bird that can only be found on these islands. The cormorant has lost its ability to fly, training it for stealth in the water, where it is able to dive several meters to catch its food. In fact, its wings are only about a third the size they would need to be to fly.
The evolutionist model would predict that the evolution of species means that animals actually gain new information and benefit from positive mutations. But it's abundantly clear, in the case of the cormorant, that the exact opposite has happened. These birds have experienced a loss of information.
These birds have come up out of the water. They've cleared a path. The one bird on the left, this cormorant, has chased off the iguanas, and these two birds are doing a little ritualistic dance around each other. I've never seen anything like this before. This is amazing. But the territoriality of these cormorants, just kicking the iguanas out of their way so they can claim the top of this rock, is absolutely amazing.
Blue eyes, bluish green eyes.
The cormorant came to this island. Possibly, this is a bird that would have died, or the ones that went out to sea would not have been successful. And so the greatest amount of success in the survival of this bird is when they're on land. And in terms of the principle of mediated design, they lost their ability to fly, and the emphasis came on their ability to go underneath the water to hunt for food. So this bird is really unique in that it didn't start out this way. It didn't start out flightless. We believe that when the birds came here, they could fly. But in adapting to this environment, the strongest cormorant, the best cormorant for survival here, was one that worked well in the water. And apparently God built into the genetic infrastructure of this animal the ability to lose the flightless, the ability to fly, and to emphasize other genetic potential that's made it very successful here. It's a remarkable example of the fact that God planned from the very beginning to give animals like the cormorant the ability to adapt to different environments, not by mutating into new creatures, but by emphasizing specific types of genetic potential that was already built into it.
Marine iguanas and the flightless cormorant are evidences of what Darwin interpreted as the result of natural selection. Species are able to change and to adapt to their environment. Those animals most suited to their environments, something Darwin called favored races, thrive and produce offspring. Animals less suitable tend to die off, a process leading to changes in diversification.
But then Darwin takes a great leap of faith. From so simple a beginning, endless forms most beautiful and most wonderful have been and are being evolved. Darwin concludes that small changes within a kind, something we can observe, are proof of something which has never been observed, evolution, or the transformation of one kind of animal into another. This presents a huge question. Is natural selection proof of evolution?
You know, this place is amazing. The Galapagos Islands. I can see why Darwin was so fascinated with them. The idea behind evolution is the origin of species and how you get new species from pre-existing species. Well, here we have an organism who's obviously related to those on the land, but yet have adopted a completely different behavior and lifestyle. But imagine the surprise when these marine iguanas were seen to be interfertile with the land-based iguanas. Evolution is all about the origin of new species. But in this case, those that we thought were different species are really the same species. It's the opposite of evolution.
Let me make sure I understand natural selection, which is as I understand it, natural selection is the crux of Darwin's theories. That's the big idea that he had. Evolution would say natural selection, which is, the dominant survive and evolve, leads to new information that creates new species. A creationist would say that natural selection is because of the information that's already there that allows for potential.
The Bible begins with discussions on taxonomy and on kinds. So taxonomy is how we name and classify animals, giving them names, and the kinds are the original created orders. Okay, well, when God created these original kinds, whatever the original penguin kind was, whatever the original bear kind was, he built into them an amazing sequence of information which is found in their genetic code that does allow them to adapt to different circumstances and to emphasize different traits and different characteristics based on a number of different factors. Now, if this is what's meant by natural selection, then we are 100% behind it. That's not what Darwin means. That's not what people are being led to believe today. What they're being led to believe is that natural selection is a survival of the fittest that leads to certain animals being taken out while other animals are getting stronger and better by gaining new information and transforming into brand new kinds of animals. We've never seen it. It's never been recorded. It certainly hasn't been recorded at the Galapagos. It's contrary to the biblical understanding of science and the scientific understanding of science. That's what we oppose. We don't oppose the idea that animals change. We do oppose the idea that they change into new kinds of animals.
Evolution, you remember, talks about these big changes. It doesn't just talk about an ape becoming a man. That's a big change, but it's not it's not as big a change as a clam turning into a man, and so in evolution, a fish, has become a person, and the fish, of course, came from an invertebrate and on down, so these big changes. It was in the 50s that some creation biologists began to think biblically and recognize that in the Bible says that God created things after their kind. It says it 10 times in Genesis chapter 1. 10 times, count them, 10 times. I mean, if God says something once, that's important, but if he says it 10 times in 20 verses, there's an emphasis there. And God was saying that he created things after their kind. Well, what's a kind? A kind is a grouping of, like dogs, the dog kind. Well, it doesn't mean he created beagles and cocker spaniels and poodles. It means dogs. And there's a lot of room to vary in a kind. And even we call them different species now. But that kind has limits. There's a lot of dogs and there's a lot of cats. But dogs and cats are of a different kind. And there's no mixing. And there's no evidence that there ever was an in-between between them. They just are separate. That's exactly what the Bible says. And once creationists and once Christians got that understanding of that God created after their kind, all these different animals, then that's allowed the creation
creation movement gets started and to blossom as it has.
To the evolutionist, the idea of natural selection and evolution are largely interchangeable. And more than any other animal in the Galapagos, the finch has become synonymous with Darwinian natural selection. In the first edition of On the Origin of Species, Darwin briefly addresses the Galapagos finch, but in later edition, he leaves them out altogether. This may have to do with embarrassment over his poor techniques and lack of meticulous research on the Galapagos. Darwin shot 31 specimens of Galapagos finches, representing most of the island's 13 species, but he sometimes confused the finches for mockingbirds, and he didn't bother to label his findings by island. It was left to others to help Darwin make sense of his research. Nonetheless, National Geographic magazine stated that in the same Galapagos finches, modern Darwinists can observe evolution in real time. This amazing claim is due to the research of Peter and Rosemary Grant, two scientists who began yearly observations of the finches in 1973 and continued meticulously cataloging them on Daphne Major Island for more than 30 years. The Grants discovered that the characteristics of the finches changed rapidly in response to island weather patterns.
When we come to a place like Galapagos and we see this just legions of finches everywhere we go, here's the story. If Darwin was right, it would mean that the changes in the finches would not only be cumulative, they'd build on past generations, but they would also be directional, moving in a particular direction, sort of towards superfinch or something like that. That is not what we see here. What we see is that beak sizes change. Sometimes they get bigger, sometimes they get smaller, based on the ability of the bird to adapt to different environmental weather patterns and other conditions that are here. Finches change because God has built in this genetic infrastructure that allows them to change, but they're not becoming anything other than a finch. And the change that happens very rapidly. Yet another example that the Galapagos Islands are a showcase for creation, not a laboratory for evolution.
Even at the microscopic level, the same principle is manifest. Pierre-Paul Grasset made a similar observation speaking to the study done with bacteria over several decades. What is the use of their unceasing mutation if they do not change? In sum, the mutation of bacteria and viruses are merely hereditary fluctuations around a median position, a swing to the right, a swing to the left, but no final evolutionary effect. In the end, the finch, traditionally a star witness in the defense of evolution, is actually Exhibit A among the animals of the Galapagos for the biblical account of created kinds.
In the unique designs of the marine iguana, the flightless cormorant, and the rapidly diversifying finch population, we see natural selection, not as proof of evolution, but as proof of the wisdom of the Creator and the majestic complexity of His design, a design that enables each kind of animal to adapt and thrive.
Thus far, our team has visited Santa Cruz, Jervis, and Fernandina Islands. We've observed animals different than any I have ever seen before. I've taken hundreds of photos, and I can see why Darwin called this a world within itself. I love to sketch and draw, and it seems everything I see here is evidence of a higher art, a beautiful and complex creation. Our guide told me that we had been given a front row seat in one of the greatest displays of animal life he had seen in 25 years on these islands. He thought we were lucky, but I knew it was the Lord.
Right now, we're watching something really oh, tremendous! Look at them dive down. You gotta get that. Wow! Okay, we're watching just a remarkable moment. These are blue-footed boobies that are diving down like kamikaze pilots right into the water. There's probably 100 of them out here, and it's a feeding frenzy. Wow! This is phenomenal. It's like one aviation division after another. In goes the first round, then waiting for the next one to come, then boom! Another one hits the water. Takes them about 2 minutes to take the food, take the fish,
then out they come again. Look at them go, look at that. Boom, right into the water. But when they take off, wow! I mean, these are like missiles coming down at an incredible rate of speed. The blue-footed booby gets its name from the Spanish word bobo, which means clumsy fellow. But the truth of the matter is, while this animal is clumsy on land like the penguin, you put it in action out here in the water when it's flying, it's a thing of beauty. There's nothing clumsy about it at all.
But how exactly does this bird get the blue feet it's named after? How are any new traits passed on from one generation to another? It's a big issue, because without an answer to this question, there is no mechanism to support a theory of evolution. Like his grandfather Erasmus before him, Darwin supported a form of Lamarckism, a theory of hereditability developed by French biologist Jean-Baptiste Lamarck. It proposed that individual traits are passed through use and disuse. Why do giraffes have long necks? Lamarckians argued that when one giraffe stretched the size of its neck trying to find new food, it would develop a stronger and longer neck. That giraffe would have a baby giraffe, and the babies would then have stronger and longer necks. Today, this theory, an essential building block for Darwin's model of evolution, has been discredited. National Geographic magazine says that modern genetics turns the spotlight on his biggest mistakes. Darwin's own ideas on the mechanism of inheritance were a mess and wrong. Darwin's error was powerfully illustrated through the groundbreaking discovery of DNA. He knew life was complex, but he had no idea just how complex it was. DNA is a nucleic acid that houses genetic instructions, or blueprints. These blueprints are accessed during the growth and development of all known living things. It's what gives us our eye and hair color, our features. Everything about us is written in code, complex code. The human body contains about 2 tablespoons of DNA, and each DNA molecule is about 6 feet long, and it has been estimated that the entire amount in our 1 trillion cells would stretch back and forth to the moon 5,000 times. What's evident is this. For all living things on this planet, there is an incredibly complex code, more complex than any supercomputer on Earth. Yet this question persists. How could this massive amount of precise and detailed information contained in DNA come about by random chance and natural processes? The other obvious question is, what was the original life form? After all, Darwin's book is named on the origin of species. In 1871, Darwin wrote a letter to Joseph Dalton Hooker, putting forth the idea that the original spark of life could have begun in a warm little pond with all sorts of ammonia and phosphoric salts, light, heat, electricity, etc. present, so that a protein compound was chemically formed, ready to undergo still more complex changes. Abiogenesis, the study of how life on our planet could have arisen from inanimate matter, has yielded many theories, including an alien race seeding life on Earth. However, evolutionists widely believe that the original spark of life was in the primordial seas, some 3.5 billion years ago. The Emmy Award-winning PBS Nova film, The Miracle of Life, says that tides and currents swept the molecules together, and somewhere in this ancient ocean, the miracle of life began. From these one-celled organisms evolved all life on Earth. Professor Harold Morowitz, molecular biologist, estimated that the smallest and most simple living organism would need to have a minimum of 124 different protein molecules. He estimated that the probability for all these molecules to form by chance in one instance would be the fraction 1 divided by the number 10 to the power 8060. He also calculated the formation of one E. coli bacterium in the universe at 1 in 10 to the power of 100 billion. Sir Frederick Hoyle gave the example of a tornado ripping through a junkyard and assembling a Boeing 747, something he called nonsense of a high order. From all practical purposes, this means a probability of 0.
Okay, we are quietly trying to make our way through this beautiful mangrove garden of mangroves here, and we're looking at some sharks that are in the water. So we're trying to be very quiet not to disturb them, and we're also finding some sea turtles which are surfacing, and this is sea turtle mating season, so it's very interesting how they're all coming up, sometimes in groups of 2s, and it's just it's breathtaking to be quietly going through this particular area and seeing the wildlife, a lot of wildlife hitting out underneath the mangrove base out there, where they call it their home.
To get inside the bay, so we're gonna be in the middle of the dinghy, head down.
Okay, we're squeezing.
Watch out on the right hand side. Watch out.
We're squeezing right through one of these mangrove gardens. This seems like we're a scene from one of the great adventure movies. I'm thinking of Teddy Roosevelt going down the Amazon River with his son.
I have my little finger dangling in the water. He keeps coming back. He leaves, but he keeps coming back and trying to bite it. I haven't let him get it yet. Keep my finger. But he's the most curious pufferfish I think I've ever seen. Jump, please.
We saw dozens of sea turtles, but only a few sharks. So one of our field producers, Peter, took things into his own hands. Literally.
What did you do to your finger?
Yeah, so we're looking for sharks. I sliced my finger and dripped blood in for a while, but it took a while, but then some big sharks showed up.
I said somebody should cut their finger and put some blood in the water. It was a joke. Yeah, I'm not going to say things like that anymore.
In the mangrove garden of the Galapagos, we see a world of diverse creatures. And one of the most interesting things we see here is that many of them have similar or homologous body parts. But why? Why do animals as different as the sea turtle and the dolphin both have flippers? The same could be said about penguins and seals. One is a bird and the other is a mammal, but they too have flippers. When dealing with morphology in Chapter 13 of Origin of Species, Darwin argued heavily that homology, the study of comparative anatomies, was conclusive evidence of common ancestry, but it could be better understood as the handiwork of a common designer. While on Jarvis Island, Dr. Tom Ford, PhD in biomechanics, describe to us some of these amazing biological similarities between animals and even humans.
If it was from a human hip, you'd have much more of a round bony process here. It would fit into a socket like the hip does. But the shoulder has a process that's a little more flat. It looks like a golf ball sitting on a tee. So it gives you much more range of motion, but it's not as stable as a human hip. This end looks more like an elbow would. It's going to be a joint that only moves in flexion and extension, more than likely. This is going to be 3 dimensions. This right here looks like, on the human arm, you have what's called the bicipital groove, and it's the long head of the bicep, comes up and through the shoulder joint. So probably the muscle belly, it looks like, may fit in there, and a tendon's going to run through the joint.
Do similar body parts point to a common origin in an evolutionary tree of life? For Darwin, the answer was a resounding yes. Here again, this essential ingredient of Darwinian evolutionary theory has been discredited by the science of genetics. Modern genetics has shown that many homologous animals are completely unrelated. How is it possible that humans and giant squids have both developed eyeballs with so many similarities down to the retinas? Why do completely unrelated animals living in separate environments independently evolve remarkably similar characteristics? Evolutionists attempt to explain this phenomenon through a process known as convergent evolution. The idea here is that animals in unrelated lineages independently evolve similar traits. In other words, birds, bats, bugs, and reptiles that fly were directed by a non-intelligent process to the same conclusion: wings. British paleontologist Simon Conway Morris says, "There is an optimum body plan, which life will inevitably evolve towards, with evolution bound to stumble upon intelligence." But the very idea of natural selection having an evolutionary goal implies intelligence, and this goes against the entire basis of the model. The evolutionist sees these similar traits as proof of common ancestry or a common evolutionary goal, but we see them as proof of a common designer, and we believe that Jesus Christ is that exceedingly wise designer. Darwin made his argument from homology and morphology, essentially looking to comparative anatomical structures and the way they change. Well, this argument has been utterly blown out of the water. The idea was this: well, look at a gorilla. It seems to have arms like you, seems to have a head like you. Doesn't that show that you come from some sort of a common ancestor? The same things were done with other animals. In fact, today evolutionists will tell you that whales came from a pig-type creature that existed before the whales. Why? Well, because they're mammals, and so mammals started on the land. So the fish came onto land, and the land went back into the water, and they became whales. And a lot of the things they're looking at are morphology and homology. They're looking at comparative anatomical structures. This argument is a complete loser argument. And it's a loser argument because genetics is proving to us that this is completely false. There are similarities of design structure found within the world that God has created. What does it really prove? A common designer. It's a common designer. We have a common designer that has built in certain infrastructural design components into all of the different animals. Evolutionists will say, well, we're this percentage related, but guess what? We're almost that closely related genetically to a banana as well. So it's far more complicated than the evolutionists are willing to tell us. The third one was intermediate forms that we'd find in the fossil record. And Darwin said, you know what, we don't have them yet. But they're coming. We're going to find them. You mark my word, within 100 years, we're going to find these transitional forms in the fossil record. John, have you seen any transitional forms lately in the fossil record?
I've been studying a lot about fossils here lately. I'm writing a book on fossils.
I think we're still waiting.
There's just no transitional forms. I mean, there are the same categories that are alive today. These kinds that we see today, the dogs and the cats, and well, we see extinct cats and we see extinct dogs, but they're dogs and cats.
So the fossil record is constantly emphasizing to us, again, God created kinds, and there's a lot of different variation within those kinds, but there's nothing in between the kinds. There's not a half cat, half dog. So here are Darwin's big arguments, and all of them are rejected today. They're all false. Therefore, why do evolutionists continue to believe in evolution? Well, Stephen Jay Gould and others have pointed out in the past that the alternative is impossible. They simply could not accept a Christian worldview. So they have to accept by faith a system, even though they don't have the foundations to prove the basic assumptions. They accept their assumptions by faith, even as we accept our assumptions by faith, namely that the Bible is true and God is sovereign.
Doug surprised me. I learned that he hadn't always been such an avowed creationist, and that he owed his change of mind to a book written by Dr. John's father, Dr. Henry Morris, the founder of the modern creation movement.
Both his book and Dr. John's father, Dr. Henry Morris, had a profound impact on me. I was just a completely excited young evolutionist unbeliever when I was a boy, because I went to government schools where I was taught evolution. I watched PBS. Boy, PBS, I love those documentaries about evolution. I ate them up. But then I read this book. I read the Bible and I read the Genesis flood. And those books, first the Word of God got into my heart, and then when I read the Genesis flood, everything made sense. And I went from being a very committed evolutionist to being a budding young creationist with a passion for this. And at that time I hoped and prayed that the Lord would allow me to someday do the very things we're doing here.
When we look at these strange and unusual formations, it seems we're staring into the ancient past. But the reality is, each of these islands is relatively young, birthed violently out of the ocean in a rush of fire and lava.
For the evolutionists, the answer to some of these glaring issues is the idea that the Earth is billions of years old, and just about anything is possible in that amount of time. George Walden, in his book, The Origins of Life, says, "Time is in fact the hero of the plot. Given so much time, the impossible becomes possible, the possible probable, and the probable virtually certain. One has only the wait. Time itself performs miracles. But can the Earth really be as old as the evolutionists claim?"
Doug, you see that the two different kinds of rock there toward the water, and around over here you see this is the lava that was extruded from that volcano within the last 100 years or so, and it covered this whole area. But the layering above that is quite interesting to me. It's very thinly bedded, and the closer you get, you still see these thin, fine little beds. That is due to an explosive eruption. The volcano was what it was. The lava flow rolled out of the crater and then came down this way. But this explosive eruption just boom, it went up, and then as it came back down, it went probably out as a pyroclastic flow, it's called. And as it came down, it just shot out in this direction, probably in all directions, and laying down one after the other within seconds, one layer after another, these laminae. Now, you know, when I was a geology student, when I was in graduate school, I was taught that whenever you see these fine little gradations like this, that these are formed, they say, in a lake environment or maybe a lagoon, something like that, and it's seasonal deposition. In the winter, there'll be a little bit, just less than a millimeter, and then in the summer, there'll be less than a millimeter. And so whenever you see this layer, a winter-summer couplet, that represents a year. And if you went over here to this cliff, you'd see millions of those layers. So obviously, it took millions and millions of years. No, it didn't. It probably took 4 hours or 2 hours. I mean, it just happened right now. Just boom, boom, boom. With a catastrophe, things can happen in a hurry. Things that we are taught to assign great ages to can happen in a hurry. This reminds me of Mount St. Helens. I've studied Mount St. Helens up in the state of Washington for some time, and Mount St. Helens erupted in 1980. Of course, it's erupted numerous times, but the big eruption was in 1980. And the lava dome, the solid lava dome that plugged up the vent, that rock has been dated with radioisotope dating. Now, it erupted in 1980. The theory is of radioisotope dating that when it's in liquid form, the magma, it resets the clock at zero. So if you were to date a rock formed when it was recently liquid, then it should basically date
an accurate time.
Too young to measure. But you know how old that
lava at Mount St. Helens dates?
No, how old?
It dates at 2.4 million years.
Okay, so this raises a pretty fundamental question about radioisotopic dating.
We saw it happen, in 1980, in fact, there have been many of the recent volcanoes that have gone off, from Vesuvius to Krakatoa to Pompeii to just name them. They've all been dated, and every one of those recent volcanoes has dated millions and millions of years
What's
old.
the problem? Is this a faulty dating method?
I think the method is wrong. The measurements are precise. The equations are correct. Everything about it is right. But the theory, it's based on the assumptions behind the theory. I think those are wrong.
Darwin has often been presented as an open-minded Christian, an unbiased naturalist in search of answers when he came to Galapagos. But by the time he arrived here, his opinion was firmly set on two key issues. First, Darwin had rejected the biblical record of history and origins. In his autobiography, Recollections of the Development of My Mind and Character, he writes, "Whilst on board the Beagle, I'd gradually come by this time to see that the Old Testament, from its manifestly false history of the world, was no more to be trusted than the sacred books of the Hindus or the beliefs of any barbarian." Darwin brought two books with him on the voyage of the Beagle. One of them was Principles of Geology by Sir Charles Lyell, presenting the view that the Earth was vastly older than the Bible claimed. Lyell based his assumptions on uniformitarianism, or the idea that the present is the key to the past. Put simply, the process that we observe today have continued at the same rate since the beginning of time, and account for most of the changes we see, such as rivers slowly eroding away vast areas like the Grand Canyon. Not only did Darwin reject the biblical record by the time he reached Galapagos, but he embraced Lyell's uniformitarianism, and later claimed his work to be half out of Lyell's brain. These were the glasses Darwin was wearing when he came here. And for his model of evolution to work, hundreds of millions of years are required.
Evolutionists work by the premise that the present is the key to the past.
Uniformitarianism.
Uniformitarian thinking. And at present, we see that the moon is receding farther and farther away from the Earth year by year. It's a measurable rate. Well, if the Earth were millions and millions of years old, millions of years ago, the moon would be much closer than now.
Assuming the same rate, which is what evolutionists do.
Present rates and present processes. But if the moon were closer, my goodness, what would it do to the tides? I mean, if the moon were, 100,000 miles closer or so, then the tides would be huge. They would maybe wash over the continents. Life would be impossible. The tidal zone where most of the life exists, in that high energy zone, well, where would they live? Because that zone is moving so far.
We're surrounded by oceans filled with salt. Is there a message that the salt gives us as we look at the dates, the chronologies of the Galapagos Island?
As the rain falls on the continents, it dissolves certain chemicals, and then the streams flow to the river and to the ocean, and the ocean's salt content is building up year by year. Well, it's a simple calculation. It's a simple way of thinking. If the present is the key to the past, if uniformitarian thinking is correct, then the oceans are gaining the same amount of salt every year. And, well, we can measure how fast it gains the salt now, and we can measure how much salt is in the ocean now. And just a simple division, you could tell how old the ocean is just by the salt content and the rate of introduction of salt. If the Earth were millions of years old, as the evolutionists say, or billions of years old, if life evolved in a salty sea, then that would mean that the oceans would be so choked with salt that life would be impossible. Nothing could live in that salty of an ocean. So it looks like the oceans are another message that the Earth was created not very long ago, just like the Bible says.
water is filled with sea turtles. The amazing thing about these sea turtles is that they survive. Sea turtles lay lots of eggs. Very few of them actually make it because they're picked off by the very birds that are flying around here that are predators. They're looking for these young little sea turtles before they get back in the water. But despite this fact, they're all over the place. Beautiful animals, beautiful sea turtles. Not only sea turtles, but sharks. An amazing array of reef fish. Very, very beautiful. And then we've got sea lions interacting with us, around us. No fear of man. Very playful. I'm gonna go back down under and see if we can count up a couple more sea turtles.
I was learning a lot about creation and evolution, and even more about the men who were teaching it to me. What I learned about Dr. John was shocking. I knew he was braving these islands despite a 30-year battle with multiple sclerosis. But I didn't know just how far he had gone to conduct his research.
Now, I'm sorry. Struck by lightning and went blind.
You know, I've been involved in the search for Noah's Ark over on Mount Ararat in Turkey. I've been there many times, and the very first expedition that I took, I was leading this expedition, 5 men of it, and we were up on the top of the mountain, just up at about, it's a 17,000 foot high mountain. There's a glacier cap on it, and we were up on the glacier up near the summit, and suddenly a storm came up, and we were just in this storm. We were up in the clouds. It was the most frightening thing. I mean, we weren't just in a storm, we were in the clouds.
Inside
and
the
thunder was just, the thunder was here and the lightning was here, and before it was over, the 3 of us that were climbing that day were actually struck by lightning. It's hard to explain it, but it was like we were exploded off the mountain. We were on about a 45-degree slope and landed way down there and rolling down the mountain, and when I finally got stopped, after bashing into things all the way down, I realized that I was totally paralyzed from the waist down. Lightning, or the electrical current, had gone up one leg and down the other and destroyed all that was there. I mean, I just don't know how else to say it, but here we were at about 14,000 feet elevation, and nobody was going to come looking for us. We were dead. I mean, there was no option. We couldn't walk. We couldn't roll down the mountain. We just couldn't get down. And the other 2 were injured more than I. So the only thing we could do was just cry out to God. And we did for hours. It was just a special time. And after about 4 hours after being struck by lightning, I think the Lord just reshaped my legs and allowed me to stand and care for the other 2. And we made it through the night. And then we actually stayed up on the mountain for another week. We did all kinds of search. That was a very productive week in the search for Noah's Ark.
Dr. Morris has always really impressed me. His courageous and adventurous spirit have inspired me, but there is something else. We're both the sons of men who have spent most of their lives teaching and defending the Bible and the biblical record. I know that this is why he is here, to honor his father, and I am here to do the same.
Oddly enough, one of the most amazing experiences I've had here was something my camera couldn't capture. Late last night, just after we passed over the equator, I went to the top of the boat and gazed to the sky. In the absence of civilization, I have never in my life seen so many stars. What I saw from the boat was breathtaking, but what can be seen from telescopes and satellites is unbelievable. And I'm learning that this beautiful canvas of planets and stars has something interesting to say about the age of our universe. In 1972, astronomers Carl Sagan and George Mullin pointed out what is now known as the faint young sun paradox. According to the standard solar model, stars similar to the sun will gradually brighten over their lifetimes. Some 3.5 billion years ago, the time when life has been said to have appeared in the sea, the sun would only be around 70 to 75% of its current capacity. A staggering reality that would mean the Earth would essentially be a block of ice. A far cry from Darwin's warm little pond. I wondered why these glaring inconsistencies went relatively overlooked. Neither the sun nor the moon supported a multi-billion-year-old Earth, an argument that challenged evolution at its very core.
know, Josh, just look around you here. There's a reason why sailors called this place the world's end. It looks completely desolate. I think in the modern mind, it even looks what some people would call primeval, because they look at rocks like this, they look at a world like this, and they think, you know, that's what I imagine the world looked like millions of years ago. But there's another story, and the other story comes from observation, and it comes from asking the right questions. It means, son, that when we look out at these rocks over here, we're looking down at the waterfront, we're starting with the right set of assumptions. And part of my mission for you as your dad is, in my heart, is that you can be a Christian who comes to a place like this and thinks like a naturalist, really thinks like a scientist for the glory of God. The exciting thing is that's the first thing that God gave to Adam. Remember that the Lord told Adam to name all the animals. That's taxonomy. And when we come here, we're not performing taxonomy, but we are investigating, we're asking questions. And this is going to be incredibly important because the world that you're inheriting, son, is a world that is full of questions and issues. And the war of the worldviews, which has been played out here in the Galapagos Islands, is the inheritance that your generation is receiving. That means that you, your friends, the young men and women that you're growing up with, they're going to have to speak to all these different issues. So I just want you to do what Kipling said and fill the unforgiving minute with 60 seconds worth of distance run. Just take it, study it, start from the right place, and then speak to the glory of God. So let's keep watching, let's keep learning.
As our trip continued, I was exposed to an intense debate that I barely knew existed, a debate that had been going on long before I was born. And I wondered, why is this contradiction between evolution and the Bible so important?
Why can't you just believe in evolution and believe in God?
John, this is a complete fight to the death. It really is. This is a battle between two competing worldviews, which are literally at the centerpiece of the debate of the modern world. It's between, do we believe that God is the creator of the earth, or do we believe that man is simply the result of random processes, mutations, process over a long period of time? The reason why this is so incredibly critical is because in the Darwinian worldview, man is the result of a process, not the result of a creator God. He is not the result of a designer. The Bible is not true. There's no way to reconcile the Bible and the Word of God with evolutionary thinking.
Bear with me for a second. Let's say evolution is true. Play that out for me. What are the implications to our world, to our lives, to our families, if the Bible isn't true, evolution is?
We've seen the implications, and the implications are this. If evolution is true, and man is simply a result of a process with no inherent worth and dignity that comes from God himself, then it means that man's life isn't valuable. And so, if we're in a struggle for survival of the fittest, people that are not perceived by the elite class to be of as much value as others, maybe they shouldn't be alive. That was Hitler's idea. That was Margaret Sanger's idea. That was the philosophy of the eugenics movement. That's the basic predicate of racism. Racism begins with the proposition that some people are more valuable than others because of their skin color. And Darwin himself, in his book, The Descent of Man, propagated that idea. Darwin taught that certain men were more evolved than other men, and the more evolved men would beat out the lesser evolved men. This is an evil philosophy. Well, he said that Caucasians were more evolved than Aborigines, for example, more evolved than natives from Africa. This is a wicked philosophy. And what other people did with this, they took that philosophy and they said, well, if that is the struggle of survival of the fittest, why not aid the process? Hitler, Margaret Sanger, Planned Parenthood, the original abortion movement, which was really a eugenics movement, meant to wipe out people whose skin color were darker than others. There is no hope in evolution. Evolution is a defeatist, scientifically unsupportable philosophy which is fundamentally at war with God. And you know, at the end of the day, when we're really talking about Darwinism, we're talking about a faith, because there are certain assumptions that can't be proven. They're accepted by faith God isn't part of the process.
So did Darwin know what the can of worms he was opening?
Darwin absolutely knew what he was doing.
The darkness of evolution came as a total surprise to me. What I realized was, the worldview of Christianity and the worldview of evolution are totally opposite, and a belief in evolution could lead to horrific consequences.
It has been said that what parents allow in moderation, children take to excess. As Darwin had inherited a legacy of skepticism from his grandfather Erasmus, he too would leave a multi-generational legacy through advocates who would take his ideas to their logical extreme, applying the biological thesis of Darwinism to social theory. Darwin's principal disciple, Thomas Huxley, would influence untold thousands of his day in the new faith of agnosticism, a term he coined. One of those converts, a student of Huxley named H.G. Wells, would turn the world upside down with his innovative science fiction novels, even as he advanced the most radical and violent forms of race-driven population control and eugenics. Wells would invest in the life of a woman named Margaret Sanger, with whom he had an adulterous relationship. But it was Sanger, perhaps more than any other social theorist of the day, who would transform society with the radical views of the eugenics movement, a movement designed to promote selective breeding as a means of improving the human species. As the founder of Planned Parenthood, this Darwinian would train millions to abort babies, reject children, and condition society to dispose of the unhealthy. These were Darwin's disciples, and they took his teaching seriously. Using Darwin's thesis, they would usher in the most violent century in recorded history. At the end of the 19th century, as evolutionists rushed to find missing links, graves of the Aborigines in Australia were dug up to study their large jaws. When the graves ran out, Aborigines were hunted, slaughtered, and boiled for their bones. Thousands of their remains reside at the Smithsonian in Washington, D.C. In 1906, a Congolese pygmy from Africa named Ota Benga was forced to live as an exhibit in the monkey house of the New York City Bronx Zoo to promote the concept of human evolution. 10 years later, he committed suicide. Darwin knew that his book might send shockwaves, challenging the most basic assumptions of the Christian faith, and it did. When he published on the origin of species, his wife Emma feared for his reputation. One of Darwin's most influential mentors, Adam Sedgwick, lamented, "I have read your book with more pain than pleasure. Parts I read with absolute sorrow because I think them utterly false and grievously mischievous. Many of your wide conclusions are based upon assumptions which can neither be proved nor disproved. Why then express them in language and arrangements of philosophical induction? Darwin's path was this. Compromise in the authority of Scripture gave way to skepticism, skepticism to disbelief, and disbelief to open hostility to the God of Scripture. In his autobiography, Darwin would declare, "I can indeed hardly see how anyone ought to wish Christianity to be true, for if so, the plain language of the text seemed to show that the men who do not believe, and this would include my father, brother, and almost all my best friends, will be everlastingly punished, and this is a damnable doctrine." In the year 1860, just 6 months after the publication of Darwin's landmark work, a famous debate took place in Oxford, England, between Bishop Samuel Wilberforce, son of William Wilberforce, the famous liberator of the slave trade in England, and Darwin's protege, the wildly popular religious cynic Thomas Huxley. The heated debate over Darwin's new theory of evolution raged for hours.
Sir, I would rather be descendant of a monkey than to use my gifts of oratory to spread lies!
Lies?
Lies, sir!
You're saying that the Word of God is lies?
Then, to everyone's shock and surprise, an older man rose in the midst of the emotionally charged room. And it's reported that he held a heavy Bible over his head and implored the audience to believe God rather than man. The Bible-carrying man was none other than Admiral Robert Fitzroy, the former captain of the HMS Beagle and the 5-year travel companion of Charles Darwin himself.
Gentlemen! Ladies, I beg of you, believe God rather than man. 25 years ago, I captained the ship that took Mr. Darwin to the Galapagos Islands. We spent 5 years together, and we came to vastly different conclusions.
In the decades following the now famous voyage that brought these men around the world and to the Galapagos, Fitzroy had become a passionate Christian, a humanitarian, and a defender of the Genesis account of origins. After the publication of On the Origin of Species, Fitzroy forever regretted bringing Darwin to the Galapagos. In a private letter to Darwin, Julius Carus wrote, "I shall never forget that meeting of the combined sections of the British Association when at Oxford in 1860, where Admiral Fitzroy expressed his sorrow for having given you the opportunities of collecting facts for such a shocking theory such as yours." Captain Robert Fitzroy walked where Charles Darwin walked. Like Darwin, he acted as a lay naturalist, collecting the flora and the fauna of the Galapagos. But even though Fitzroy witnessed the same things as Darwin, he reached vastly different conclusions. And so do we.
Darwin died on April 19, 1882, and nowhere is the antithesis between Christianity and evolution more clear than in the face of death. On the Galapagos, we see it all around us. In the evolutionary worldview, the death of animals and humans is the basis for progress, the hope that evolution will continue through the survival of the fittest. But from the Bible's perspective, death is a consequence of man's sin against God. It's the penalty for disobedience, and the hope of redemption from death is found in the gospel, which places man's hope in Jesus Christ, the Son of God, who overcame death by laying down his life as a perfect sacrifice.
Evolution is survival of the fittest. In Christianity, the most fit of all, Jesus Christ, died for the unfit. That's you and me. That's the way God thinks. That's the way the Creator thinks.
The book of Ecclesiastes in the Bible says that to everything there is a season and a time for every purpose under heaven. Our time on these amazing islands of Galapagos was coming to an end, but the memories we've made, And the beauty we've witnessed will never leave us. Every last moment of our expedition was priceless. And that's why I wanted to spend a few with Joshua.
With great opportunity comes great responsibility, and I do have a present for you. This is a little symbol of our trip. This is the naturalist tool of the past, the magnifying glass, and I want you to take this, and I just want you to remember that a good Christian soldier of the Lord is someone who goes out there and researches and investigates. So, as this trip comes to an end, as your dad, I commission you to take everything you've learned here and to live heartily for God and to tell the stories of the Lord. And part of those stories is what happened here on the Galapagos. And it's a story that hasn't been written completely yet. There's more to be told. What we've learned this week, this is a showcase for creation, and you and your generation need to be telling that story to the world.
Yes, sir.
In the introduction to On the Origin of Species, Darwin says, "A fair result can be obtained only by fully stating and balancing the facts and arguments on both sides of each question." During my time in the Galapagos and in the months to follow, I have taken such a journey. In The Greatest Show on Earth, Richard Dawkins calls those of us who reject evolution history deniers, and even compares us to those that deny the fact of the Holocaust. He says that all except the woefully uninformed are forced to accept the fact of evolution. But I have found this to be a complete and utter lie. The months I've spent researching and experiencing this issue for myself haven't led me to a crisis of faith or a sudden disbelief in the Bible. Like Admiral Fitzroy, the exact opposite has happened. I found my faith in Jesus Christ has become much stronger. And the more I learn of this incredible world we live in, the more I see his undeniable fingerprints.
I'm walking away from the Galapagos Islands with a renewed sense of the important mission that my own father began more than a half century ago. The Bible is the true foundation for science. Darwin failed because he rejected that foundation. It's now been more than 150 years since Darwin set foot on these islands, and one thing is clear: they are very special. There are a lot of things happening here, but evolution is not one of them. On display is the beauty and diversity of God's handiwork. These islands are not a laboratory for evolution, but they are a showcase for creation.
What an amazing place. The Galapagos is a gift from God. This is a world teeming with strange and unusual life. Every rock, every plant, every creature cries out, "I am not an accident. I am not a random process. I have been fearfully and wonderfully made." The message of the Galapagos is clear. This is my Father's world. And every step of this great adventure has reminded me that we need to take our children to the field. We need to bring them to those places where the battle rages. The compromises of past generations have left them with a painful legacy which they must overcome. But they will overcome. By God's grace, they will overcome, because we are more than conquerors through Christ Jesus our Lord.
Coming to these islands with my father has been such a great privilege. He has taught me so many things. Our journey has been inspiring. We have been able to explore the glories of God's creation together, and the lessons I've learned here will be with me for a lifetime. I've learned that the ideas and the visions of one generation will help to shape the next, for good or for evil. It was true in Darwin's day, and it will be true in mine as well. I'm coming back here someday, and God willing, I'll bring my own children with me. I will take them where my father took me, and together, we will experience the many wonders of these mysterious islands.